Hello and welcome to Chapter 18 on the respiratory system. With the respiratory system, we're going to focus on the anatomy and the structures. Then we're mainly going to look at ventilation, gas exchange, and gas transport. We're going to briefly touch on the regulation in terms of chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. The diseases I want you to be aware of, more that they're associated with the respiratory system than detail themselves. When you look at respiration, there is pretty much an internal respiration and an external respiration. Externally has to do with the exchange in the lungs and to the tissues of the lungs with the capillaries and the alveoli. So this is getting the carbon dioxide out and getting the oxygen into the blood. Then there's an internal exchange. The internal exchange happens with the cells inside the body. Internal exchange, you will be taking oxygen to the body cells and then absorbing the carbon dioxide from the body cells. Remember, carbon dioxide is waste. When we look at the structures of the respiratory system, you mainly have two ways of getting air in, the nasal cavity and the oral cavity or the mouth. The advantage of breathing through your nose or your nasal cavity is that your nose has hair to filter, a good blood supply to warm, and a lot of sinuses to moisten. So breathing through your nose, the air is warmed, moistened, and clean. Breathing through your mouth, none of that happens. Then both the nasal cavity and the oral cavity will join at the pharynx. The pharynx is a passage of both air and also food, also called the throat. Then there is a division right at the bottom of the pharynx. The epiglottis is a flap which will cover over the windpipe or the larynx and the trachea. Anytime there's food going down, because you don't want food or water in the lung. With the larynx is a voice box. The voice box is held by cartilage, and it's this cartilage which is the Adam's apple on men, and then the epiglottis is at the back. Here you can see the epiglottis. The epiglottis will usually close during the swallowing process. The vocal cords open and close and vibrate based on the sound that needs to be made. And a little known fact is that you can only talk when you're exhaling. You can't talk when you're inhaling. After the pharynx is the trachea, and you can tell the trachea because it has these cartilaginous C-shaped rings around it. The advantage of the C-shaped rings is to keep the trachea open. Also, they're C-shaped and not completely closed, so that way as food goes down the esophagus or the food tube, it can stretch into the trachea if it needs room. Once it divides, you end up with the bronchus or bronchi or the bronchial tree, and they will divide and divide again, and then you end up with your bronchioles and your alveoli. Your alveoli are the air sacs where gas exchange occurs. You all have the mediastinum, which is the area between. Now, another part that is very important but not often thought about is your diaphragm. The diaphragm is the large muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. Your diaphragm, as we'll learn about later, is very important in breathing and the breathing process. Good. When you look at your lungs are, you have two lungs. The right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. Left lung is smaller because the heart takes up part of the space. When you look at the coating on the lungs, there is a pleura. There is a visceral pleura, which is the coating or the lining, so it's actually a membrane right on the lungs. Then there's a space, and then there is the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura sticks to the rib cage, that sticks to the visceral pleura, which stick to the lungs. This is very important in ventilation because as the chest cavity enlarges, the fact that the lungs are stuck to it will cause the volume inside the lungs to enlarge. When you look at the tissue of the lung cells, you will see very open and loose connective tissue, very spongy, very elasticy. The lungs have a very good blood supply. So you have the alveoli, which are the little grape-like air sacs, and a very good capillary supply over top of them to allow for gas exchange. The interesting thing about the respiratory system is you have all this work to get your oxygen into your body, but then it does straight diffusion between the alveoli and the capillaries. As I said, the pleura, you have a parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, and the pleural space is in between. If you ever have a punctured chest cavity, your lung will collapse if air gets into this pleural space, because then your lungs won't stick to your your rib cage. There's two types of ventilation. There is inhalation and there is exhalation. Inhalation is an active phase. Exhalation, normal exhalation, only occurs because the muscles that caused inhalation relax and the air is pushed out. When you look at inspiration or inhalation, it is important to realize there are two sets of muscles involved. You have the diaphragm, which will pull the chest cavity down, and you have the external intercostal muscles. As the external intercostal muscles contract, it will cause the rib cage to move up and out. With the contraction of the diaphragm, it moves back down. When you have the up and out and downward movement, you will enlarge the chest cavity. In the process of enlarging the chest cavity, you will increase the volume. As you increase the volume in the area, that results in a decrease in pressure, and then because of the pressure change, air will rush in. Please realize air is not sucked in, it's more pulled in. Then during normal expiration, the diaphragm will relax and the external intercostal muscles will also relax, and this will cause the air to push out. In situations of forced, not normal, forced expiration, you will have the contraction of the internal intercostal muscles, and these are the muscles that you eat when you eat ribs. They will cause a contraction resulting in the rib cage being forced upward. As a result of the diaphragm pushing upward and the rib cage moving downward, you end up with the decreased lung space, and the decreased volume results in an increased pressure, and the air is then pushed out. So air move in by expanding the chest cavity. So to review, diaphragm contracts, external intercostals contract, rib cage moves up and out, diaphragm moves down, the volume increases. Increased volume, decreased pressure, air moves in. That is inhalation, very active. And then to expire your air in normal ventilation, the muscles, the diaphragm muscles and the external intercostal muscles relax. And you have normal expiration by the recoiling of the lungs pushing the air out. In situations of forced air, you will have the internal intercostal muscles contracting, forcing the air out. When it comes to looking at your breath, if you realize it, you can have basic in and out, gentle resting air. The volume that you bring in and out in your gentle resting breath is called the tidal volume, basic in and out. So basic breathing, but you can also push out extra air. That is your inspiratory reserve. Then you can also take a really big breath. This is your expiratory reserve. When you consider your big breath in and your big breath out, that will give your vital capacity. Now, because the air sacs are in the smallest part of the lung, you cannot force them out. They are single-celled epithelial. They do not have the muscles to contract and force out. So there is always some air in the lungs, and this is called the reserve. When you add the reserve with the vital capacity, you get your total lung capacity. In females, it's about 4,000 millimeters or 4 liters. In males, it is 5.2 liters. Now realize this volume depends on your health, your size, and also your age. As you get older, you lose your lung capacity. In university, I had a lung capacity of 5.2, and now that I'm no longer as young as I was in university, I'm blowing just under 5. So I have very good lung capacity, but then I am also a very large woman. Okay? You will need to know tidal volume, inspiration reserve, expiration reserve, and vital capacity. This is called a spirogram, which is the picture, and it is taken on a spirograph, which is the meter, or it can also become a spirometer. And basically it's like a little gauge you breathe on or a bag you breathe into, and it measures the volume. The whole idea of gas exchange is to get the gases into your body and then they can diffuse across. When you think of pressure, it's kind of like concentration. So in your lungs, you breathe in oxygen. Now realize we're talking about oxygen, but not only 21% of the air you breathe in is oxygen. Most of it is nitrogen, but it just goes in and out, stays there. No big deal unless you're doing deep sea diving, and then if you come up too quickly, that nitrogen will cause bubbles, and that's when you get the situation cause the bends. Oxygen is 21% of normal air. Because there is a larger pressure of air in the lungs or the alveoli, it will be pushed in by partial pressure or diffused into the red blood cell and carried on the hemoglobin of the red blood cell. We will get more into how that is carried when we talk about blood, but most of the oxygen in your body is carried on the hemoglobin of the red blood cell. Then carbon dioxide will leave. Carbon dioxide is a little trickier. Carbon dioxide is carried in 3 different ways, which we will talk about later. Well, no, let's talk about them right now. 3 ways carbon dioxide is carried. It is carried based on the fact that some of it, a very small amount, is dissolved, but gases do not dissolve well in warm liquids, such as an example of pop. The gas comes out. So a small amount of carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood. A small amount of the carbon dioxide will be attracted to the red blood cell and carried on the hemoglobin. This makes the compound carbonaminohemoglobin. The largest concentration of carbon dioxide is formed when you look at the bicarbonate ion, or in our, we call it hydrogen carbonate ion. Bicarbonate ion is more of an American term. Hydrogen carbonate is what you will hear of it as in your chem class. So the majority of your carbon dioxide is converted into a bicarbonate ion, and that bicarbonate ion is then charged and can float nicely in the blood. We haven't talked about the regulation of respiration, and I only have 5 minutes left. So this will be the end of this one.